A reading from the Gospel of Mark. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your minds not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Does that strike any of you as an odd thing for Jesus to say? Right? I mean, Jesus has been talking to his disciples at a moment up in the northeast of the land of Israel, in the part of the country known as Caesarea Philippi back then, and today known as Banyas. Some of you have probably been there. Those of you who were on the trip to Israel, the interfaith trip a few years ago, it's up near the Syrian border, and it's a beautiful place. There is a spring-fed creek that is crystal clear that runs right through there and comes out of a big rock-faced wall that has caves in it. And in fact, one of those caves is where there is a pool and it was an altar to the ancient Greek god Pan, P-A-N. This is the god of shepherds and flocks, right? And in fact, this god was depicted as being a horned figure, half man, half goat, you know. And in fact, the word Pan gives rise to our English word panic, because this was supposedly the god of fertility and inspired many sort of raucous parties and orgies that were very chaotic and often frightening, I'm sure, mostly to women and goats, don't you know? Right? Well, right there at Banyas, Peter declared that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And it was, in effect, a defeat of fear and panic. It was a conquering of the god Pan, and it was a confession of faith. Jesus is the Christ, and that meant that no pagan gods or human powers may compete with the power that has been given to God's anointed one. So shout it from the mountaintops. This is good news. Jesus is the one who is sent from God. He's the one we have always hoped for and longed for and waited for. Hold on a second. Jesus says, not so fast. Tell no one. Huh? I mean, isn't this the same Jesus that later gives the Great Commission to the disciples to go into all the world and proclaim the gospel, to tell the nations, to baptize them and teach them all things? And shh, tell no one. What is going on here? A little more than 100 years ago, a German New Testament scholar named Wilhelm Wrede came up with an interesting theory about this. He was studying, and by the way, this is not the only time in the Gospel of Mark that Jesus says such a thing. After healings and other times when people came to know about his identity, he tells them, don't tell anyone, don't tell anyone. Well, so Wrede was curious about this, and he actually coined a term for what was going on in the Gospel of Mark on these occasions. He called it the Messianic Secret. And his theory initially was that because Mark was the first gospel to have been written, it was closest to Jesus' time, and it was the most authentic, which gave a real true picture into Jesus' own consciousness and the fact that he had some hesitation and was somewhat conflicted himself about his being the Messiah. At this time, he still didn't fully understand it, and he didn't want to tell anyone because it would force his hand. It would make him accept his role, in other words. Now, he thought that other gospels, which were written later, sort of glossed over Jesus' own indecision about that, and that they didn't pay as much attention to it. But eventually, other critics discredited his approach, and he even himself moved away from his original theory about this. Probably a more plausible theory about it was that Jesus, if you think about this, wanted to avoid undue fame at this earlier stage of his ministry, which would have created a kind of draft where it would have moved him too quickly and not allowed him to direct his own process, where he knew he still had to go to Jerusalem, to the holy city of David, and confront the powers there, and he didn't want to preempt that whole process. Maybe so. One other possibility. 2 weeks ago, Susie Painter was here, and she mentioned an American Franciscan monk named Richard Rohr. He writes on the Christian life from a deeply spiritual perspective, and in his recent book titled Falling Upward, which, by the way, I recommend highly to you, he suggests that Jesus tells them not to tell others about his messiahship because they were not yet ready to bear the truth of it. They were not spiritually prepared to tell it because they were not experientially prepared to accept it. And this, I want to suggest to you today, is the real Messianic secret. It doesn't have to do so much with Jesus as it does with us. Jesus was prepared to accept his messianic identity in his life. But the disciples were not yet prepared to do so because they were still more committed to a way of life that has to do with success defined as the love of power more than the power of love. Listen to what happens right after Jesus tells them to tell no one about his messiahship. He begins to tell them that that very role will require that he will suffer, that he will be rejected by the religious authorities, be killed, and on the third day be raised from the dead. In other words, Jesus understood in his spirit that the real secret of sacrificial love involves vulnerability and pain. He understood that there's a way of life that looks like success to the world but ultimately fails. And there is a way of life that looks to the world like failure, but ultimately succeeds. Well, Peter took Jesus aside and tried to explain the way of the world to Jesus. It says he rebuked him, and just can't you see this picture? I mean, Jesus really, look, you're very spiritually sensitive, but really, let me explain to you how things work in this. Peter is calling out Jesus for his wrong-headed approach to being Messiah. It's like he's trying to run Jesus' campaign. And he's trying to tell him that being captured and tortured is not his idea of a hero. That his idea of a hero is someone who avoids being captured by the enemy. He likes winners, not losers. Does any of this sound familiar to you? Some things never change with us, right? Jesus is talking crazy, Peter thinks. Jesus is talking crazy. We still think. But no, Peter was the one talking crazy. As all of us are when we buy into an understanding of life that is committed to winning by winning. Jesus rebukes Peter back and makes it clear to him that the way up is down. And only when you are flat on your face are you in a position to be raised up, which is the gospel. Rohr makes the point that this is what marks the big transition between the first half of a person's life and the second half, and it is not easily said as to what age that is, right? But this is when we meet the moment of our soul. And he thinks it's either something that happens to us or something that we do to ourselves. But it's something that crushes us, something that makes us know we're not in control. A death, a divorce, the loss of a job, a bankruptcy, a stupid decision, denying Jesus 3 times before the cock crows. Sooner or later, we are all going to be there. You are going to be there. Right? We will all experience something that will wake us up to the futility of trying to make a life for ourselves that is only about winning. Sooner or later, we will all meet that moment when we will need the grace of God to remind us that we are all of us sinners and failures, and none of us gets out of this life alive. What then? Well, then and only then will we be in a position to really understand the real Messianic secret. Then and only then will we realize that we have hope after loss and life after death. Then and only then will we realize that no sin, no embarrassment, no foolishness really ruins us forever. Because, listen to this, God is the one who is in the forever business, the only one. And God is very good at God's business. David Gregory was on top of the world when he was named to be the new host of Sunday morning NBC News program Meet the Press in 2008. He would succeed the beloved Tim Russert, and he was on top of the world. But with ratings dipping in 2014, NBC unceremoniously dropped him. It felt to him like a fall from grace, and it precipitated a spiritual crisis. Like all the rest of us, as long as life is moving pretty much on an upward trajectory for us, We figure God's on our side. We're doing all the right things and everything's going to be okay. And then all of a sudden, what? God dropped us when we dropped? You see, the thing is, we don't come seriously to grips with the heart of what's important and enduring when we are only busy building that container of our identity. And we don't really pay attention to the contents of it. George W. Bush tried to help right after Gregory got his job. Interesting anecdote. Gregory was visiting with the president in the White House, and Bush asked, "Hey, Gregory, how's your faith?" It's a really interesting question to ask someone who just had his greatest success. It's one we ought to ask each other, actually, because that's a moment of great vulnerability when you're up high, right? And most of us don't ask that question then. But of course, Gregory only looks back on it now as having been important. He was more cultural than religious Jew most of his life. Gregory married a Methodist Christian, actually, and as interfaith couples, many of them who worship here with us in Temple Emmanuel, we understand the way this works. They have to negotiate what happens with the children, and she agreed to let the children be raised as Jewish, but somewhere in middle life, she decided that she wanted to go back to church, and he also started going with her. And after all of this, it became all the more important as he began to re-examine his own Jewish faith and tradition and began reading and studying it and going to church and listening to sermons as well and gaining new insights. He calls the book that he has just written by the name of the phrase that W had offered to him, "How's your faith?" But it's subtitled about his unlikely spiritual journey. And I would suggest to you that actually that's just completely wrong because given the nature of the real Messianic secret, that is exactly a likely spiritual journey. It has to occur for us after a moment like that. But in the Wall Street Journal piece this week, he put it this way. He said, "I had put effort into figuring out who to be so that I could succeed as the host of a Sunday news show. But last year when I lost that job, which offered me satisfaction and a high profile, I had to figure out who I was without cameras or prestigious titles. This hasn't been rosy or easy. It's been faith that steadied me. The humbling loss turned out to be a gift because I have seen how many fresh opportunities for growth and happiness await, even if it hasn't gone according to my plan. Most plainly, I understand in joy, pain, and even in personal failure, God is close." And then he closed his article by citing a passage of Scripture from Isaiah 46:4 that his Jewish teacher, Erica Brown, wrote to him in a note on his last day at NBC. She's a wonderful teacher. I follow her on Twitter, and you can too. But she wrote to him these words that God says through the prophet, I am he who will sustain you. I have made you, and I will carry you. I will sustain you, and I will rescue you." Nice. It's a word we need, all of us, to hear for the second half of life, really. And it's a word that most of us will not fully understand until the second half of life, really. But I want to say to you today that I think we need to hear it in the first half of life, too. There are so many people walking around in a stupor after failing or falling, losing or being lost, And they don't know where to turn because they've been so busy gaining the whole world, they've been losing their own soul, And they look at the cross and they see it as a symbol for losers instead of the ultimate symbol of winning in the only way that matters. Which is why I think we need to learn these truths from the cradle to the grave, even if they don't completely hit home with us until we hit that pothole in the road. And it's also why this morning, when I gave their first Bibles to first graders in Sunday school, the verse we turned them to was in Isaiah. It was very close to the one that David Gregory was turned to at age 45. God says through the prophet Isaiah, "Do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine." We need our heads to be filled with that powerful truth as early and as often as possible, so that later in our lives, when that moment comes, that our hearts are cracked open and are ready now to receive that truth, it can fall down into them because it's already there. And now at last, we will have not just knowledge, but understanding. We will get it where we need it because it's already there. And it's why we come to church from cradle to grave. It's why we're never too young for church and never too old. We may not understand everything that we are learning right away, but we will be better able to bear it when the time of bearing comes. This is also why we don't preach a prosperity gospel around here. For one thing, the very phrase is an oxymoron. If it's about worldly prosperity, it's not about the gospel, people. It's also why we don't preach a security gospel around here. Because if it's about worldly security and keeping ourselves safe by the power of God, it's not the gospel. The gospel has to do with spiritual prosperity, a flourishing life, a real life with God. It has to do with eternal security. And if we follow Jesus instead of Peter and his way, he will teach us the real Messianic secret, and it is that those who want to save their life will lose it. But if you lose your life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel, you will save it. That's the real secret, see, and the secret is that the way up is down. And that you can only really see that when you're down. The good news is this. There's really no such thing as falling from grace. Because when we follow Jesus, there's only falling into grace. Amen.